Every subscribe tells us this story matters. Thank you for being here. A pharaoh wearing a double crown and a double uraeus sits carved in black granite in an Egyptian temple, but he was never Egyptian. His name is carved beside falcon gods and sun discs, in a script that isn't his own, in a religion he adopted rather than inherited. For over a century, textbooks called his people a shadow of Egypt, a vassal culture, a copy with darker skin and less credit. Then, in 727 BCE, an army marched north out of the desert and did the opposite of what history books expected. It conquered Egypt. Not the reverse. This is the story of the Kingdom of Kush, the Nubian civilization of the Middle Nile, in what is now Sudan. For 75 years, Kushite kings sat on Egypt's throne as the 25th dynasty, a line historians nicknamed the Black Pharaohs. New ancient DNA work on Nile Valley remains is now complicating the simple version of that story, the one where Kush borrowed Egypt's culture because Kush was, underneath, basically an extension of Egypt. The genetic signal doesn't match a clean north-to-south migration, and it doesn't match a clean south-to-north one either. If the Kushites ruled Egypt, why does their DNA, not their crowns, not their pyramids, refuse to tell a simple story of who conquered whom? Before the genome complicates anything, you need the story everyone was taught, because that's the version the DNA is about to unsettle. For most of the 20th century, there was only one acceptable version of who built Kush. Kush emerged along the Middle Nile in modern Sudan, its power moving through three capitals over nearly 3,000 years. First Kerma, around 2500 to 1500 BCE. Then Napata, around 900 to 300 BCE. Then Meroe, from roughly 300 BCE to 350 CE. Kerma alone is considered one of the earliest complex urban civilizations anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa, rising at the same time as, or even before, Egypt's Middle Kingdom. Egypt would eventually reverse that relationship by force. During the New Kingdom, from about 1550 to 1070 BCE, Egypt occupied and colonized Nubia for roughly 500 years, embedding its religion, its writing system, and its burial customs into the Nubian elite. Egyptian gods, Egyptian temples, Egyptian titles carved onto Nubian kings. It looked, on the surface, like absorption. Mainstream Egyptology through most of the last century, shaped heavily by colonial-era scholars, framed Kush accordingly. A derivative culture, pyramids and hieroglyphs and gods borrowed wholesale from Egypt, with little originality of its own. So when the Kushite king Pa invaded and unified Egypt around 727 BCE, founding the 25th dynasty, early historians often described it not as a foreign conquest by a distinct African power, but as a restoration of order, as if Egypt had simply reclaimed itself through a different set of hands. The kings who followed PC, Shabaka, Shabataka, Taharka, Tantamani, ruled an empire stretching from the Nile Delta deep into Sudan, the largest Egypt had been in centuries. Then, around 656 BCE, a Syrian invasion pushed Kush out of Egypt entirely, and its center shifted south to Meroe, where it developed its own still undeciphered script, Meroitic, and its own pyramid tradition. Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt does, over 200 at Meroe alone. That's the consensus story. A Nilotic African kingdom, Egyptianized under occupation, that later reasserted itself politically and eventually built something distinctly its own. It's tidy. It's also, according to the people who actually pulled DNA out of Nile Valley skeletons spanning this entire timeline, not what the population history looks like at all. Ancient DNA doesn't care who's sitting on the throne. Recovering it from the Nile Valley has never been easy. Heat, humidity cycles, thousands of years of burial in conditions that shred genetic material, which is part of why usable ancient genomes from this region stayed rare for so long. As recently as the early 2020s, researchers doing this work in Sudan noted that before their studies, there had only been a handful of genome-wide ancient samples from the entire Nile Valley, and those came from Egypt, not Nubia itself. The most extensive Nile Valley ancient genome dataset published so far comes from a site called Kulub in Sudan, analyzing 66 individuals who lived roughly 1,000 to 1,300 years ago, centuries after Kush's political collapse, in what's called Sudan's Christian period. Researchers are careful to frame what follows as probability, not certainty, since a single site can't speak for an entire civilization across 3,000 years. But the pattern those genomes revealed is the one now reshaping how scientists think about the deeper Kushite era too, Roughly 40% of the ancestry at that site traced to a local, Nilotic-related population, with the remainder consistent with ancestry introduced through Egypt, tracing further back to populations from the Bronze and Iron Age Levant. Here is where it gets complicated. That same research found something almost nobody expected going in. Burials showing sharp social stratification, clear differences in status, in grave goods, in treatment of the dead, showed almost no corresponding genetic differentiation between the groups. Rich and poor, high status and low status, buried side by side in the same cemetery, carrying essentially the same ancestry. Political and religious hierarchy, in other words, wasn't built on the back of a separate genetically distinct ruling class. It was layered on top of one shared population. Extend that pattern backward toward the Kushite period itself, and the anomaly at the center of this video comes into focus. Elite Kushite burials during the 25th dynasty and after are soaked in Egyptian religious and material culture. Pyramids, hieroglyphic-style inscriptions, the worship of the god Amun carved into temple walls at Napata. If cultural borrowing on that scale reflected large-scale intermarriage or population replacement, the way it often has elsewhere in history when one group colonizes another for 5 centuries, you'd expect the ancestry of the people living and dying in Kush to show heavy admixture, genetic mixing, like 2 different rivers merging until you can no longer tell which water came from which source. Instead, the deeper pattern the genetic data increasingly points toward is a Nubian population that stayed remarkably stable across enormous stretches of political upheaval, even while its rulers wrote their names in someone else's script and prayed to someone else's gods. Political conquest didn't move the gene pool. Religious transformation didn't move the gene pool. Centuries of occupation didn't move the gene pool. Stable. That one word undercuts the entire derivative culture framing from a moment ago. If the DNA stayed local while the religion and architecture didn't, then Kush's people weren't a genetically Egyptianized offshoot slowly assimilated by their more powerful neighbor. They were a distinct Nile Valley population that appears to have selectively adopted Egyptian religious and political symbolism, deliberately as strategy, not as evidence of being absorbed by it. Egyptianization, on this reading, wasn't something that happened to the Kushites. It was something the Kushites did, on their own terms, while remaining who they already were underneath. So if the throne moved between 2 populations that stayed genetically distinct from each other the entire time, whose story is Kush actually telling? Egypt's twin or Egypt's rival? The mainstream explanation has an answer. It also has a problem. The first explanation is the one you'll find on most museum placards. Call it cultural adoption without population replacement. Kush's elite deliberately took on Egyptian religious and political symbolism, pharaonic titles, Amun worship, pyramid building, as a legitimizing strategy, especially after centuries of direct Egyptian colonial rule during the New Kingdom had already planted those symbols throughout the region. The logic isn't unique to Kush. Elites across history routinely borrow the iconography of a dominant neighboring power to shore up their own legitimacy. Later African and Mediterranean states adopting Roman-style titles centuries after Rome fell is one well-documented parallel. Here, the numbers back up how deep that borrowing could run. Roughly 500 years of direct Egyptian administrative presence in Nubia, from about 1550 to 1070 BCE, was long enough for a temple to Amun at Napata and an entire royal titulary modeled on Egypt's to become permanently embedded in Kushite political life, long after Egyptian troops had actually withdrawn. Under this theory, Pi's invasion of Egypt in 727 BCE wasn't foreign conquest at all. It was framed, in the Kushite king's own inscriptions, as restoring proper worship of Amun to a fractured, factionalized Egypt that had lost its way. Kush arriving not as an outsider, but as the more faithful keeper of a shared religious inheritance. It's a clean theory. It explains the temples, the titles, the borrowed gods convincingly. What it doesn't explain is why 500 years of direct administrative occupation, Egyptian officials, Egyptian garrisons, Egyptian settlers living inside Nubian territory for 24 generations, left behind temples full of Egyptian gods but bloodlines that stayed stubbornly, measurably local. Colonial occupation elsewhere in history almost always leaves some genetic trace, even a small one. Here, the trace the theory would predict is largely missing. There's a second, more complicated explanation for that gap, and it has to do with what happened after Egypt lost control of Kush, not during it. It's not what happened while Egypt ruled Nubia, it's what happened in the gap after Egypt left. Call this the second theory. Deep Nile Valley continuity paired with selective elite intermarriage, rather than any large-scale population mixing. When Egypt's New Kingdom administration finally withdrew from Nubia around 1070 BCE, it didn't hand power to a ready-made successor state. There was a gap, roughly 300 years before the Napatan state emerged that would eventually produce Paya and the 25th dynasty. 3 centuries, no Egyptian garrisons, no new wave of Egyptian settlers, just a local population, left alone with what it had inherited. What it had inherited was a set of temples. During that gap, local Nubian elites appear to have reorganized political and religious life around existing Amun temple centers, Napata chief among them, near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, without any indication of a fresh migration from Egypt to sustain it. Researchers studying this period are careful to frame the reconstruction as probable rather than certain, since written records from the gap itself are thin. But the implication, if the pattern holds, is significant. The Egyptianness of Kushite religion wasn't something actively imported generation after generation. It was inherited once, then preserved locally for 300 years by a population that remained demographically Nubian the entire time. 300 years is long enough to fully indigenize a borrowed religious system, long enough that by the time Piye was born, worship of Amun at Napata wasn't a foreign import anymore. It was simply what his ancestors had always done. This version is more contested than it sounds, and it has a real logistical problem sitting inside it. Hieroglyphic writing, monumental temple construction, precise stone cutting for pyramid building. These aren't skills a population just remembers on its own for 3 centuries without practice, without teachers, without an ongoing pipeline of trained scribes and architects. Maintaining that level of technical continuity with no evidence of continued contact with Egyptian experts is, to some scholars, a genuinely difficult knowledge transfer problem, one this theory doesn't fully resolve on its own. And here's where it recontextualizes the theory that came before it. If there was no meaningful population link or administrative connection to Egypt running through those 300 years, then Piye's invasion of Egypt in 727 BCE wasn't a passive act of restoration, Kush returning something it had merely held in trust. It was something bolder. A confident, independent Nubian power, having fully absorbed and reshaped Egyptian religious symbolism into something authentically its own, then marched north and imposed that hybrid Nubian-Egyptian identity back onto the very civilization it had borrowed from in the first place. Not inheritance, reclamation. If Kush wasn't simply imitating Egypt, and wasn't simply isolated from it either, there's a third possibility, and it's less comfortable and far less settled than the first two. The most unsettling explanation isn't about migration at all. It's about who gets to write history. Call this the third theory, historiographical distortion. Much of the Kush as a derivative of Egypt, framing that dominated the field for a century, wasn't primarily a conclusion drawn from evidence. It was shaped by 19th and early 20th century European Egyptology, a discipline that was, as a matter of well-documented record, frequently reluctant to credit a sub-Saharan African civilization with independent achievements. Pyramid building, monumental architecture, an entire literate tradition in Meroitic script. Under this theory, the new genetic continuity data isn't overturning some neutral, purely scientific consensus. It's exposing how much of that consensus was ideological in the first place, dressed up in the language of archaeology. This one has to be hedged carefully, because 2 very different things get tangled together here, and pulling them apart is genuinely hard. On one hand, ancient Nile Valley DNA really is difficult to recover, so earlier generations of scholars were often working from limited or non-existent genetic evidence, filling gaps with reasonable-sounding guesses rather than data. On the other hand, some 20th century scholarship did explicitly minimize Kushite and Nubian originality, crediting achievement after achievement to Egyptian influence by reflex, a pattern historians of the field have documented directly, not speculated about. What's harder to pin down is how much that documented bias shaped the specific genetic continuity findings coming out now, versus how much it simply shaped the cultural interpretations that came before any DNA existed to check them against. That's an open question this video isn't going to resolve. Whatever the reason behind the old consensus, one thing is now hard to deny. Stand on the ground where Kush actually rose, and the story gets even stranger. Picture standing at Jebel Barkal, a lone sandstone mountain rising 98 meters straight out of the Nubian desert, at dawn, near the modern town of Karima in Sudan. The ancient Nubians believed a natural rock pinnacle jutting from the mountain's face was the throne of Amun himself, the literal birthplace of kingship. Around that mountain, the ruins of at least 13 temples, and several pyramid fields stretching into the desert. Sudan holds more pyramids in total than Egypt does, over 200, against roughly 118 in Egypt, despite almost nobody associating Sudan with pyramids at all. These Kushite and Meroitic pyramids are smaller than Egypt's, steeper-sided, and built centuries after Egypt itself had largely stopped constructing them. Egypt moved on from pyramid building, Kush didn't. Kush kept a supposedly dead Egyptian tradition alive and evolving for another 1,000 years, as if it had never belonged to Egypt exclusively at all. Further south, at Meroe, the undeciphered Meroitic script is carved directly into monument walls. A complete writing system, its individual signs adapted from Egyptian hieroglyphic and demotic characters, but encoding a language that isn't Egyptian at all. Modern linguists still can't fully read it. Standing on that ground, you're not looking at a copy of Egypt. You're looking at what happened after a Nile Valley civilization took a set of borrowed tools and made them entirely, unmistakably its own. An independent, literate state whose family lines are only now, slowly, being reconstructed one degraded skeleton at a time. And that idea, made entirely its own, is about to be turned upside down one more time. Here's the reframe that changes how all of this fits together. The twist is this. The entire debate over who influenced whom, Egypt or Kush, may rest on a false premise. The assumption that these were ever two fully separate populations trading culture back and forth across a hard, meaningful border. The emerging genetic continuity evidence points somewhere else. It suggests a single, deep Nile Valley population lineage running back millennia, out of which both dynastic Egypt in the north and Kerma then Kush in the south emerged as regional political variations. Researchers frame this cautiously, as a pattern the data is consistent with, not a settled fact. But the shape of it is striking. Not two distinct peoples who later collided, but branches of one shared ancient river valley gene pool that periodically unified under one crown and periodically split under different names, different gods, different ruling houses. Under that reframe, the 25th dynasty Black Pharaohs weren't outsiders conquering a foreign land, and Egypt's earlier 500-year occupation of Nubia wasn't simply one people subjugating a genetically separate other. Both were phases of one long, internally connected Nile Valley political history. A single continuous story that later historiography and racial and ethnic categories entirely foreign to the ancient world, carved into two separate, opposing boxes that never quite fit the evidence underneath them. None of this erases what actually made Kush distinct. It had its own language, its own steep-sided pyramid style, its own unread script, its own royal customs, including a line of powerful ruling queens, the Khandex, with no clear equivalent on the Egyptian side of the border. At least half a dozen of these women ruled independently at Meroe between roughly 170 BCE and 314 CE, wielding a level of formal political power dynastic Egypt's queens rarely approached. That's real, documented distinctiveness. What the shared lineage picture undercuts isn't Kush's identity. It's the idea that Kushite and Egyptian were ever two neatly separable genetic populations in the way modern national categories assume they must have been. So the mystery doesn't resolve into Kush was really Egyptian, or Kush was purely African and entirely separate. It widens into something bigger. Ancient Nile Valley identity was never divided as neatly as either modern nationalism or colonial-era Egyptology assumed it had to be. So who were the Kushites really? The bloodline doesn't answer that with a name. It answers it with a much bigger question. Zoom out far enough, and Kush stops being a footnote to Egypt's story. Every ancient civilization historians have tried to sort by border and ethnic label was, underneath that label, a river of people who moved, intermarried, and rebuilt their identities long before anyone thought to draw a line on a map. The Nile itself doesn't recognize the modern Egypt-Sudan border, and for most of ancient history, neither did the people living along its banks. Genes moved at the pace of rivers and trade routes. Political conquest moved at the pace of armies. Those were never the same speed. What ancient DNA work is doing across the Nile Valley, and in dozens of comparable ancient population studies worldwide, is quietly dismantling a much older assumption, that ancient political rivals were automatically genetically distinct peoples too. Kush's pyramids still outnumber Egypt's. Its script is still unread. Its Khandak still ruled with a formal authority Egypt's own queens rarely matched. And its genetic story is still being written, one uncracked skeleton at a time, pulled from a region with some of the harshest DNA preservation conditions anywhere on Earth. The Kushites were never who we thought, and the bloodline behind their throne is only just beginning to tell us why.